December 2008. A man whose hair had almost completely turned gray walked into his Manhattan apartment and said something to his two sons that would later be quoted in countless books about finance. It's all just one big lie. That man was Bernie Madoff. For decades, he had been regarded as one of the most trusted investors in America. Major banks trusted him. Investment funds trusted him. Celebrities trusted him. People who had spent a lifetime saving their money trusted him too. But one day, the FBI knocked on his door. The world discovered that his entire multi-billion-dollar empire was, in reality, nothing more than a massive Ponzi scheme. When most of us hear this story, we have a very natural reaction. He's a fraud. That's true. But if the story ended there, it wouldn't leave us with much to think about. What interests psychologists, behavioral economists, and criminologists even more is a different question. Did Bernie Madoff wake up one morning 30 years earlier and tell himself, "Today I'm going to deceive millions of people"? Or did it begin in a much more ordinary way? A loss that needed to be hidden. A promise that had to be kept. A delay in telling the truth. Then another one. If the second hypothesis is correct, then this story is no longer just about Bernie Madoff. It is about a mechanism that may exist within any human being. Because almost no one grows up dreaming of becoming a con artist. And yet fraud exists everywhere. From schemes that steal millions of dollars, to an employee adjusting a few numbers in a report, a salesperson hiding a product's flaws, a resume that has been polished beyond the truth, a promise someone already knows they cannot keep. The scale is different. The consequences are different. But they all share one thing in common. The people who do these things know they are wrong. So why do they do them anyway? This is one of the most fascinating paradoxes of human behavior. Because if simply knowing right from wrong were enough to make people do the right thing, the world would look very different. No one would smoke after reading the warning on a cigarette pack. No one would run a red light. No one would cheat on their partner. No one would commit fraud. Clearly, the gap between knowing and doing is much wider than we imagine. And if we want to understand why people still deceive others, even though they know it's wrong, we have to dig one layer deeper. Not into the law, not into morality, but into the way the brain makes decisions. That is where the story truly begins. Interestingly, we often have a very simple explanation. People commit fraud because they are greedy. It sounds perfectly reasonable, but if you think about it a little longer, you'll realize that answer isn't enough. Everyone wants more money. Everyone wants an easier life. Everyone wants success to come faster. In other words, greed, or more precisely, the desire for greater personal gain, is something almost universal. If greed alone were enough to turn someone into a fraudster, then almost everyone would deceive others. But that isn't what we see. Some people are presented with an opportunity to make tens of thousands of dollars with a single lie, yet they refuse. Others are willing to trade their honor for just a few $100s. Some cheat once and stop. Others turn it into a lifelong career. This tells us that greed may be a motive, but it is not the mechanism. This is also where we need to distinguish between two concepts that are often confused. Motive answers the question, what do I want? Mechanism answers the question, why do I act this way? Everyone wants to earn more money, but one person works overtime. Another starts a business. Another invests. Another commits fraud. The motive is the same. The decision-making mechanism is completely different. That is why psychologists rarely ask, why is this person greedy? They usually ask, what made this person willing to cross an ethical line? Those are two very different questions. And the first answer lies in a need that almost everyone has, yet few people notice. Human beings don't just want to benefit. We also want to believe that we are good people. At first glance, that may seem obvious. But consider a very simple situation. You're selling your old phone. You know the battery only retains about 70% of its original capacity. If you're honest, the buyer may offer you less. If you don't mention it, there's a good chance they won't notice right away. At that moment, two desires appear at the same time. You want to sell it for the highest possible price, but you also want to think of yourself as an honest person. If those two desires collided head-on, the decision would be difficult. The strange thing is that the brain usually doesn't solve the problem by giving up one of them. Instead, it creates a new story. The battery still works fine. They should have checked it before buying. I didn't lie. I just didn't mention it. That moment is worth paying attention to, because the action hasn't changed, but the way you see the action has. Psychologist Albert Bandura called this phenomenon moral disengagement, which can be understood as the process by which people temporarily separate their actions from their usual moral standards. Put simply, before deceiving others, many people first have to find a way to stop feeling as though they are deceiving others. That is a huge difference. Someone who thinks, "I'm a bad person," will find it very hard to live with themselves. But someone who thinks, "I'm just doing what I have to do," can keep going without feeling overwhelming guilt. This explains what seems like a contradiction. Many people engage in dishonest behavior while still being good parents, good friends, and good colleagues in many other areas of life. Not because they are hypocrites in the usual sense, but because their brains have separated those two identities. They don't see themselves as bad people. They simply see themselves as being in a special situation. And that word special is the first doorway to many of the decisions that follow. If you pay attention, most justifications have a remarkably similar structure. Everyone does it. Just this once. I didn't have a choice. It's not that serious. I'm only taking back what should have been mine. None of those statements claim that fraud is good. They simply try to make one's own case an exception. That point is extremely important. People rarely change their moral values overnight. We usually begin by creating one exception, then another. Eventually, there are so many exceptions that they quietly become the new rule. That is why many major fraud cases do not begin with a perfect plan. They begin with one tiny thought, just this once. But that is only the first step. Even after convincing themselves, there is still another barrier. The first time someone does something wrong almost always brings discomfort. Their heart beats faster. They worry about being caught. They feel guilty. If those feelings always stayed the same, many people would probably stop right there. But the human brain works differently. And that mechanism is what allows one small lie to gradually grow into a fraudulent system that lasts for decades. That is also where Bernie Madoff's story becomes far more frightening than most of us realize. If you ask a mountain climber which part of a climb is the most dangerous, many people would think of the sheer cliff. But experienced climbers often point to something else, the first misstep. Because after that, everything else can happen very quickly. Fraud works in a similar way. The most dangerous thing about the first time isn't the money that's made. It's that the brain begins to learn a new lesson. So I can do this and everything turns out fine. Let's return to an everyday situation. An employee goes on a business trip. He decides to add an extra $200 to his expense report. When he hits the submit button, he's extremely tense. What if he gets caught? What if accounting checks it? What if his boss asks questions? A week passes. No phone call. No email. The money is reimbursed. No one says anything. A month later, he does it again. This time, the anxiety is a little weaker. 6 months later, the amount is no longer $200. It may be several $1,000s. And strangely enough, the guilt isn't as strong as it used to be. Looking only at the outcome, many people would conclude that he has become desensitized. But from a neuroscience perspective, what is happening is even more interesting. Our brains are designed to adapt. When a stimulus is repeated over and over without leading to meaningful consequences, the emotional response typically weakens over time. You can see this in many situations. On the first day of work, a new employee may be so nervous they can't sleep. A year later, the same job hardly creates any pressure at all. The first time many people speak in front of a crowd, they are so nervous they forget what they wanted to say. After doing it dozens of times, standing before hundreds of people becomes normal. This ability to adapt helps humans learn very quickly. But it also has a dark side. It doesn't distinguish between good behavior and bad behavior. It simply learns from repetition. Some studies using functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, suggests that when people repeatedly engage in dishonest behavior without facing consequences that match the severity of their actions, activity in brain regions associated with negative emotions tends to decrease over time. The findings vary across studies and do not mean that morality disappears. But they do suggest that feelings of guilt can weaken with time. This is a deeply thought-provoking finding. It means the brain doesn't just learn how to do something. It also learns how to feel less uncomfortable doing it. And when the discomfort fades, the moral barrier becomes lower as well. That is why many major frauds do not begin with one major decision. They develop through a slippery slope. You don't jump from the top to the bottom. You simply slide a little at a time. Each step is so small that it is almost unnoticeable. Until one day, you look back and realize you are far from where you started. This is also what many researchers who study dishonest behavior have observed. In psychologist Dan Ariely's experiments, one finding appeared with remarkable consistency. Most participants did not cheat to maximize their gains. If their only goal had been to make as much money as possible, they could easily have cheated much more. But they didn't. They cheated only enough. Enough to gain an advantage, but not so much that they could no longer maintain a positive self-image. At first glance, this seems contradictory. If you've already decided to cheat, why not cheat as much as possible? Yet that very question reveals an important truth. For most people, the real battle is not between honesty and dishonesty. It is between personal gain and the way we see ourselves. We want both. We want more benefits. And we want to keep believing that we are decent people. That is why many people do not cross the line with one giant leap. They move the line closer to themselves little by little. But if the story stopped with the individual, it still wouldn't be enough. Because consider this. A very honest person joins a company where almost everyone manipulates the numbers. A very honest person joins a team where lying to customers is considered normal. Will that person keep behaving the same way forever? No one can answer that with certainty. But we do know that the environment has a much greater influence than people usually think. There is a classic psychology experiment conducted by Solomon Asch in the 1950s. Participants were asked to answer a very simple question. Which of three lines matched the length of a reference line? The answer was so obvious that even a child could recognize it. But there was one detail. Everyone else in the room was a confederate in the experiment, except for one actual participant. They deliberately gave the wrong answer. The results surprised many people. A significant proportion of participants also gave the wrong answer along with the majority, even though they could clearly see the correct one. The interesting part wasn't that they didn't know. They did know. But being the only person who was different created an enormous invisible pressure. If something as obvious as the length of a line can be influenced by the crowd, then moral issues, with all their gray areas, are even more vulnerable to social influence. Imagine your first day at work. You discover that everyone inflates client entertainment expenses. You feel uncomfortable. A colleague smiles and says, "Every company does it." Your manager adds, "If you don't, you'll never hit your targets." Someone else says, "Don't be so rigid." Just 3 sentences. But what has just happened is more than an exchange of information. It is the process of transforming a behavior from wrong into normal. In sociology, this is known as the power of social norms. Human beings don't learn only from the law. We also learn from what the people around us accept. If everyone stands in line, you'll stand in line. If everyone runs red lights, you're more likely to do the same. Not because your morality changes overnight, but because your perception of what is normal has changed. That is also why modern organizations don't simply hire good people. They also try to build an environment where cheating is more difficult. Here we arrive at one of the best-known models in fraud research, the fraud triangle, proposed by criminologist Donald Cressy. According to this model, 3 factors commonly appear together before many acts of fraud: pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. What's striking is that none of those 3 factors is an evil nature. Pressure may come from debt, sales targets, family expectations, fear of failure. Opportunity may come from weak management systems, poor internal controls, or simply the feeling that no one will ever find out. And rationalization is the story each person tells themselves to make the decision feel acceptable. The truly unsettling part of this model lies elsewhere. It doesn't say that the people who make these mistakes are fundamentally different from the rest of us. It simply says that when all three conditions are present, the risk increases. That is a profound difference. Because if we believe that only bad people commit fraud, we will always assume we are safe. But if we understand that circumstances also shape behavior, we become more cautious about ourselves. Even so, one piece of the puzzle remains unexplained. If pressure, opportunity, and the ability to rationalize all exist, why do some people still refuse? What causes two people facing the same temptation to make completely different decisions? To answer that question, we have to examine something even more subtle. Not how people deceive others, but how people deceive themselves. And that very mechanism explains why even the smartest people, the most educated people, even those who once strongly condemned fraud, can gradually become part of it. There is a question that seems very simple. If you ask someone, "Are you an honest person?" most will say yes. If you then ask, "Have you ever lied?" most will also say yes. Those two answers seem contradictory, but in fact, they reveal a very important characteristic of the human brain. We do not judge ourselves based on each individual action. We judge ourselves through an overall narrative. In that narrative, a lie can be seen as an exception. A dishonest act can be seen as unavoidable. A bad decision can be blamed on circumstances. In other words, we don't just remember what we have done. We constantly edit the meaning of those actions. This is where a famous concept in psychology comes in: cognitive dissonance. The concept was proposed by psychologist Leon Festinger in the late 1950s. His idea was quite simple. When our beliefs and our actions conflict, we feel uncomfortable. For example, I am an honest person, but I just deceived a customer. The brain dislikes this state of contradiction. It will try to eliminate it. There are two paths. The first is to change the behavior. Next time, don't do it. The second is to change the interpretation. I didn't really deceive them. The customer also had a responsibility to do their research. If I didn't do it, someone else would. The important thing is that the second path usually requires far less energy, and that is precisely why it is more appealing. Notice one detail. Very few people describe themselves with words like fraudster, liar, or immoral person, even when their behavior fits those descriptions. Instead, they use softer words: flexible, adaptable, smart, knows how to get things done. That isn't just a matter of wording. It is the brain's way of protecting its own identity. There is an interesting study in behavioral economics. When people are reminded of moral standards immediately before making a decision, the level of cheating in some experiments tends to decrease. That doesn't mean reading a slogan is enough to make people honest. But it does show one thing. Morality is not always present on the front line of decision-making. Sometimes it needs to be deliberately activated. Conversely, if the environment constantly blurs those standards, the ability to rationalize becomes stronger. That is why an organization cannot rely solely on hiring good people. It must design a system that helps good people continue behaving well. Otherwise, over time, the system itself may change their behavior. At this point, we can return to Bernie Madoff's story. What made his case one of the most infamous financial frauds in history was not just the amount of money involved. It was the duration. The system existed for years. Throughout that time, Madoff was not acting alone. There were employees, partners, auditors, investors. Some people suspected something. Others chose to remain silent. Why? Part of the answer lies in what psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility. When responsibility is shared among many people, each individual often feels less personally responsible. If only one person knows the secret, they must confront the choice directly. But if 10 people know, each person can think, someone else will handle it. It's not my place. This isn't my decision. This phenomenon has also been observed in many completely different situations. A famous example is the bystander effect. When many people witness the same event, each individual is sometimes less likely to step in and help. Not because they are less compassionate, but because responsibility is diffused. The same thing can happen within organizations. When many people participate in a system that lacks transparency, each person sees only a very small part. And everyone can think that their own role is too small to create a real problem. That is how many collective failures arise. Not from one malicious decision, but from many small decisions, each of which seems relatively harmless. Now we need to view the story from the other side, the victim's side. There is a very common misconception. People who are scammed are gullible. If that were true, major frauds would target only the uneducated or inexperienced. Reality is completely different. Victims can be professors, doctors, engineers, corporate executives, financial professionals. At first, that may seem hard to believe. How can someone highly intelligent be deceived? The answer is that skilled fraudsters do not attack intelligence. They attack the decision-making process. Notice how most modern scams unfold. No one calls and says, "I'm a scammer." Instead, they create three elements that almost always appear together. First, credibility. They pretend to be bank employees, police officers, government officials, someone you know. Second, urgency. Your account is under attack. Your order will be canceled. The system only has a few minutes left. You need to verify this immediately. Third, isolation. Don't tell anyone. Don't hang up. Just follow the instructions. These three elements are not accidental. They are designed to push the brain out of slow thinking and into fast reactions. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman described two modes of human thinking. One is fast, intuitive, low effort. The other is slow, analytical, verifying, reasoning. Under normal circumstances, these two systems work together. But when people are under time pressure or emotional pressure, the fast system often takes over. That is exactly what scammers deliberately create. They don't want you to think. They want you to react. That is why one of the most effective pieces of advice for avoiding scams is surprisingly simple. Don't make important decisions when you are being pressured. It sounds obvious, but that very obviousness is easy to forget when we believe we are facing an emergency. And this is perhaps the greatest paradox of the entire story. Fraudsters do not exploit only greed. Many successful scams exploit trust, exploit fear, exploit the desire to protect one's family, exploit the desire to help others. In other words, sometimes humanity's finest qualities can be turned into weapons against us. That makes this topic far more complex. Because the fight against fraud is not simply a fight against evil. It is also a struggle to understand the very natural weaknesses in the way our brains work. And when we put all of these pieces together, the question from the beginning can finally be answered. Not with one simple conclusion, but with a broader perspective on human nature and the society we live in. If this entire discussion had to be summarized in a single sentence, it might be this. People rarely go from honesty to fraud in one leap. We usually get there through very small steps that we barely notice ourselves. That is why the question at the beginning of this video actually contains an assumption that is not entirely accurate. Why do people commit fraud even though they know it's wrong? It sounds as though knowledge and action always stand in direct opposition. But that isn't what happens in the brain. Before we act, we often change the way we see the action itself. In other words, most people do not begin by abandoning morality. They begin by adjusting their definition of what counts as a moral violation. That is a very significant difference. Bernie Madoff probably did not think he was building the biggest fraud in financial history on the very first day. The employee who inflates an expense claim by a few dollars doesn't think he is becoming dishonest. The salesperson who hides one small product flaw doesn't think of themselves as a fraudster. What they share is not the scale of their actions. What they share is the story they tell themselves. Just this once. I had no other choice. It's not a big deal. I'll make up for it later. When the story changes, the behavior changes. Then the brain adapts. The environment reinforces it. The norms shift, and the next decision becomes even easier. From the outside, we see a fraud. From the inside, the people involved often see only a series of decisions, each of which seemed reasonable at the moment it was made. That is what makes this subject worth reflecting on, because it doesn't just help us understand people who have made mistakes. It also helps us understand ourselves. There is a well-known tendency in psychology called the bias blind spot. People are generally better at recognizing other people's biases than their own. We can easily see when someone else is rationalizing, but we struggle to recognize when we are doing exactly the same thing. That is why the most important question after this video may not be, how do I recognize a fraudster? But rather, how do I recognize when I myself have begun rationalizing something I once believed was wrong? That is a much harder question, because no one stands in front of the mirror every morning and introduces themselves by saying, I am someone who will gradually lose my principles. It happens much more quietly. It begins with exceptions. Then those exceptions gradually become habits. But if the story ended there, it would be rather pessimistic. Fortunately, the very mechanisms that make people vulnerable to drifting away from their principles can also work in the opposite direction. If the brain can adapt to bad behavior, it can also adapt to good behavior. If an environment can normalize dishonesty, it can also normalize honesty. If the stories we tell ourselves can rationalize wrongdoing, they can also reinforce what is right. That is why organizations with transparent cultures do not rely solely on hiring talented people. They build processes that make telling the truth the easier choice. They encourage employees to ask questions. They accept bad news when it is reported early instead of punishing the people who report it. They reduce unreasonable pressures that force people to choose between results and ethics. The same applies at the individual level. Perhaps the most effective way to protect our integrity is not to be confident that we would never do anything wrong. History has repeatedly shown that people tend to overestimate their own ability to resist temptation. A more practical approach is to build habits that help us recognize the warning signs early. When you begin thinking, just this once, ask yourself why you need the words just this. When you begin thinking, everyone does it, ask yourself whether that is evidence that the action is right, or simply evidence that it is common. When you begin thinking, no one will ever know. Perhaps the more important question is, if everyone knew, would I still want to do this? Those three questions do not guarantee that we will always make the right decision. No formula can do that. But they force the brain to shift from automatic reaction to conscious thought. And sometimes, just a few extra seconds of reflection are enough to change a decision. There is one interesting detail that many people overlook when they think about major frauds. We usually remember the mastermind, but we rarely remember the thousands of ordinary people who refused to take part. The employees who resigned because they disagreed. The accountants who refused to sign. The investors who walked away when they saw something wasn't transparent. They never make the front page of the newspaper, because they never create a scandal. But they are the real reminder that circumstances do not completely determine behavior. Human beings always have the ability to choose, even when that choice comes at a very real cost. And perhaps that is the fullest answer to the paradox posed at the beginning of this video. People know that fraud is wrong, yet they still commit it, not because their knowledge of right and wrong disappears, but because there is a vast space between knowledge and action. Within that space are greed, pressure, fear, opportunity, environment, rationalizations, the way the brain adapts, the desire to maintain a positive self-image, and all of those factors interact in ways that are far more complex than the simple answer that they are bad people. Understanding this does not make us more tolerant of fraud, but it does help us see the true nature of the problem, because only by understanding how a mechanism works do we have a chance of preventing it from happening again. Perhaps the most frightening thing about fraud is not that it is committed by people who are completely different from us. The frightening thing is that it often begins with thoughts that almost anyone could have had. And for that very reason, the best way to protect ourselves is not only to learn how to recognize fraudsters. It is also to learn how to recognize the rationalizations that arise in our own minds. Because sometimes the line between a principle that remains intact and one that is lost begins with just 4 familiar words. Just this once.